Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing my October wrap-up, so we're going to be talking about all the books that I read in October. In October I read, I think, 14 books, and some of them were really short. There were a couple graphic novels in there, so I didn't necessarily have like a super large page count, but still, 14 books. That's a lot more than I was expecting to read in October. Although I do feel like in October I felt more like I was kind of not exactly in a reading slump, but I just was like feeling kind of slumpy even though I read a lot of books. I don't know what was going on with me in October. I think part of it is that I was super tired throughout most of October and September. Actually, for the past like 2 months I've been exhausted, and for a really long time I could not figure out why. Turns out I was low on iron, which can cause fatigue, and so I was just like completely out of it for September and October, and that I think is partially why I haven't been as like active and engaged online, like making videos, replying to comments, that kind of thing. Like, I know I'm not always the most consistent with replying to comments, but I've been especially bad at it recently. So I'm hoping that I will be able to kind of get back into the swing of things a little bit, because now I'm taking iron supplements and I'm feeling a lot better and a lot more like myself, and like I can actually like think and do things and not just like lie in my bed. Anyways, that's just an update on what my October's been like, but let's get into talking about the books. I'm going to try and be as succinct as I possibly can be, because I have a lot of books to talk about and sometimes I go on for a long time, so I'm gonna try and be as succinct as I can, but we'll see how that pans out. Anyways, the first book that I read in October was Radiance by Grace Draven. This is a adult high fantasy romance that I listened to as an audiobook. So in it we're following two characters from different races. One of them is human and one of them is a magical race that I have now forgotten the name of, but they are kind of forced into a political marriage. Forced meaning the political marriage is necessary. Neither of them knows each other or particularly wants to get married, but they're both willing and have agreed to go through with it. But another reason that neither of them is excited about this match, just beyond the fact that they don't know each other, is that they're not attracted to each other when they first meet each other. So they really make a connection based on their personalities, and they, you know, learn that their personalities actually click really well together, and they end up really respecting each other and building a relationship from there. I really liked the slow progression of their relationship, and that they started out just expecting to be friends with mutual respect who had kind of entered into this agreement for political reasons, and that they were both okay with that. And then the way that their relationship progresses as they get to know each other better and they start to become attracted to each other based on really their personalities and how their relationship dynamic has developed. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. As much as I enjoyed it though, I did feel like it didn't give me like a warm fuzzies kind of feeling that I usually want when I'm reading a romance. Like, when I read a romance book, I want that like warm fuzzy feeling, and this one just didn't quite give that to me. So there was a lot that I thought was fun about this, but I also just like didn't quite get what I wanted out of it. So I rated Radiance 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was The Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. This was the first book in the Legends of the First Empire series, which is an adult high fantasy series. So this is set in a Bronze Age fantasy world in which there are humans and then there are the Frey, and the Frey are kind of like elves. They have much longer lifespans than the humans, and so the humans just kind of assume that the Frey are immortal because they, within a generation, they never see one of them die, and so they treat the Frey as gods and think that they are gods, because the Frey also have magical powers, and so that kind of lends to their god status. At the beginning of the story though, we're following multiple perspectives, but at the very beginning we're following a human who accidentally kills a Frey and thinks that he has killed a god. And so that realization that the Frey are able to be killed, that they are not actually immortal and not actually gods, then of course has ripple effects throughout the people, throughout the story, as this realization comes to light. And so we're following multiple perspectives. As I said, some of them are human, some of them are Frey, so we do get to have perspectives from both sides, which is really interesting. And I liked having the Frey perspective because they are very separate and secretive from the humans, and so having somebody that was within the Frey, we got to have some more insight as to like what some of their secrets are, what their culture is. I feel like this is just very standard fantasy. There isn't a lot about it that I can like particularly point out as like particularly new or interesting, or something that really stood out as like, oh, this is really well done or really well crafted in some way. But it was just pretty solid the whole way through. It was fun. It was a little on the lighter side of fantasy, so it didn't feel like heavy or dense the way some high fantasy can. I think the writing style is pretty simple and straightforward, which I think a lot of people may like. It's not always my favorite kind of writing style, but that's why I decided to listen to it as an audiobook, so I could just enjoy the story without really thinking about the style of writing. And yeah, as I said, I thought the story was fun. I liked a lot of the characters. Of course, my favorite character is, I think her name was Suri, who is a seer who lives in the forest, and she has a wolf companion and she talks to trees. So like, that was just obvious that that was going to be my favorite character. But I had a fun time with this. I do plan to read the rest of the series, and I give this one 4 stars. Next, I read The Forgotten Kingdom by Signe Pike. This is the second book in the Lost Queen trilogy, and this just came out this year. So this is historical fiction that is set in the 6th century in like early, which is very early medieval Scotland. And as I said, second book in the series. In this one, we're following 3 perspectives. In the first book, we were following just one perspective, which was Langareth, who is the sister of the person who inspired the story of Merlin. And in that one, we were following Langareth through a lot of her life. She wanted to be trained as a wisdom keeper, which is pretty much a druid, but she was not able to. She was actually forced into a political marriage because she comes from a noble family. It becomes about her trying to figure out how to use the political power and position that she has to protect her people, their way of life, and their like spiritual lives and like spiritual heritage, because this is also right around the time when Christianity is coming into Scotland and trying to like take root there and push the old ways out. So that was the first book. This one, we are following 3 perspectives, so we still have Langareth's perspective in this, and then we also have her brother's perspective, Lailoken, who is the one that kind of becomes Merlin. And then we have the perspective of one of her children who has been sent off to become a wisdom keeper. So I was really excited to read this one because I really loved the first book, which I read last year, and I really enjoyed this one too. Not quite as much as the first book, but I still think this one, I've just really enjoyed it. So some of the things that didn't work as well for me in this is, for one thing, I'm not sure how I feel about the fact that we've kind of expanded to 3 perspectives, because while reading this, I was still really most invested in Langareth and her story, and less so in the other 2. My kind of ranking went like most interested in Langareth, then her kid who's trained to be a wisdom keeper, and then Lailoken. This one I do think felt very much like a middle book in a trilogy because the plot of it felt a little amorphous to me, and it kind of felt like it was just a lot of people doing stuff, but not necessarily like in a way that I was super invested in. Like, it felt like there were a lot of events that needed to happen and a lot of like experiences the characters needed to have, and there were places that, you know, characters needed to be placed in order for the rest of the series to progress. I also felt like this one focused more on the like larger politics and like the war and battles, which I was not as invested in. And one of the things that I had liked so much about the first book was that while it was political, it was very focused on Langareth and her character and her story and the sphere of influence that she had, and I tend to like stories that are a bit smaller in scope. And so this one kind of expanded in its scope, both in the number of characters, but then also in kind of its focus was more expanded, and to me it just ended up feeling less focused. And the things that it did focus on were just not as interesting to me. And I think that that was part of a problem also with the perspective of Langoreth's daughter, who is learning to become a wisdom keeper, because I did like her character and I was interested in her, but there was a long period of time where she was just sort of like wandering around, and it really was not that interesting, and I felt like that took up too much of the book. But then there's a point in the story where she is receiving training to become a wisdom keeper and to use these kind of this intuition, and she's kind of a seer, use those powers, and it kind of just skipped over that part, and I'm like, that's the part that I wanted to read about. I did enjoy this a lot. I mean, I still really love Signe Pike's writing, and as I said, I was really glad to be back with Langoreth's character, and I did like her daughter's character also. I just kind of wish that it had focused on slightly different things, but I overall really enjoyed the overall like experience of reading this book, and I still gave this one 4 stars. Next, I read The Lives of Saints by Leigh Bardugo. This is a companion book to her Grisha series. So this is a book that would have existed in the world of the Grisha that tells the stories of the different saints that exist in that world. And it's just such a beautiful book. This came out this month, and the stories are super short. They're like 2 to 4 pages, so like I don't even know if you can call them short stories because they're so short. But I read them. I thought that they were fun to read. It was interesting to kind of see what kind of story she had created for this world. Definitely, though, the artwork in the book is the best part of it, because it does have some really beautiful artwork. This one is my favorite picture. Hopefully it's not glaring too much. Next, I read Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. This is following our main character Yadriel, who comes from a family of Bruhaks, that in their family they have kind of a gendered magic system in which the women in the family have one kind of magic and the men in the family have another kind of magic. And our main character Yadriel is a trans boy, and his family is having a hard time accepting his gender, and they're not letting him do the ritual that he needs to do to get his Brujo powers because they don't believe that the magic will work for him. At the beginning of the story, Yadriel's cousin dies, and Yadriel decides that this is a chance for him to prove himself and to prove that he can use Brujo powers. And so he ends up summoning a ghost and accidentally summons the wrong ghost, which happens to be the ghost of Julian, who seems like the complete opposite of Yadriel. But the two of them decide to work together to find out what happened to Yadriel's cousin and to find out what happened to Julian, how he died, and tying up loose ends from his life. And then, of course, as they go on this journey together, they get closer and end up falling for each other. And this book was just so like delightful. I loved these characters so much. Just both of them were great, and I liked the kind of slow build to their relationship and the way that the two of them play off of each other, because they are opposites in a lot of ways, but I think that both of them are able to like see something in the other that other people don't really see. Like they can see who the other one truly is beneath kind of the surface of what other people may see about them. It just has a lot of very like lovable characters in it, and I had a great time reading this. After reading this, I went and read some reviews of it, and I did see a couple of people saying that they found the plot of this to be fairly predictable, and like I can definitely see in a couple of places it had some pretty heavy foreshadowing, and there were definitely things about it that were predictable maybe, but to me, the plot wasn't the point. This is one of those books that I'm reading for the characters, because the characters in this are so sweet and endearing, and I just loved them so much. I did enjoy the plot, and I thought that it was good, but that really wasn't why I ended up loving this so much. This one definitely did give me that like warm fuzzies feeling. Like one of my notes on it says like my heart explodes. So I really loved this. I actually listened to this as an audiobook, which the audiobook is excellent, but after finishing the audiobook, I like immediately ordered a physical copy of it because I wanted to have this book, and I do plan to reread this at some point, and I probably will try reading it physically. It just was such a delight to read this book. So I gave this one 5 stars. Then I read Swamp Thing by Maggie Stiefvater. This is her graphic novel that just came out this month. And this is about these 2 twins who are opposites, but they are also inseparable. One of them is really extroverted, life of the party, and the other one is much more introverted and much more focused on his scientific research. And he is doing research specifically on plants, trying to like distill memories from plants and trying to like transfer them to other plants. And at the beginning of the story, they end up going to live with their cousins for the summer. This is the summer before the 2 of them go off to college. And being in this new setting kind of exacerbates the differences between their 2 personalities. And while one of them goes to parties and makes new friends, the other one kind of pulls back in more into himself and becomes more and more focused on his research. And then some stuff happens where there's some accidents involving his research, and they find some unusual applications or consequences of this research. So I had a fun time reading this. I mostly was reading it just because it was a Maggie Stiefvater book, but I enjoyed like the naturey-ness of it. This is a very different nature vibe from a lot of the other like nature vibes kind of things that I read, but I still really enjoyed it. I have realized that I have 0 notes about this book. Apparently I didn't write down anything while I was reading it, but I did have a fun time with it. And also this one kind of snuck up on me because at the beginning I wasn't as like into it, but by the end I did like the characters and I was much more invested in it than I was expecting to be. Then I read The Physicians of Vilna by Lois McMaster-Bujold, which is like the 8th book, I think, in the Penric and Desdemona series, which is a series of novellas. So of course, once again, we are following Penric and Desdemona, and Penric is a sorcerer who has a chaos demon named Desdemona that lives in his body with him, and so he can kind of like talk to her in his mind. And the 2 of them have come to like, a really good mutual understanding, and they work together really well. So the plot of this particular novella in the series is actually about a plague, and so was not necessarily the best choice to be reading right now, but it ended up not bothering me too much. There are other books that I have avoided because I was just like, I don't need to be reading about plagues right now, but this one for some reason didn't bother me. But in this, Penric does work sometimes as a healer, even though healing is kind of counter to the demon's nature. There is a sickness that starts to break out at the local like army barracks kind of, and he is called in to help find out what's going on, and then cases start popping up in other places as well. And so at first he's just trying to keep as many people from dying as he can, but then eventually he starts searching for the source of this illness and to see if they can prevent new cases from showing up. Every time I read a book in this series, I just enjoy it. I really like Lois McMaster-Bujold's writing. I like this world. I've enjoyed this whole series and these characters. I actually especially liked this one because I liked this story arc of it. Sometimes in like novella series, some of the novellas will feel kind of incomplete, like they're not a full story arc, and this one I think felt like a very cohesive, complete story arc, and so I especially enjoyed that about it, and I gave this one 4 stars. Then I read The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. This is a gothic literary historical fiction, I guess. So in this, we are following our main character that I have forgotten her name, Margaret. Margaret, who runs a bookstore with her father, who has the bookstore and is also like a book collector slash rare book dealer. And she's kind of an amateur biographer, and one day she receives a letter from a very famous author named Vida Winter, who is inviting her to come and write her memoir. And after deliberating for a bit, our main character decides to take on the project. She goes to the author's home, and this is kind of both the story that the author is telling her, the like memoir that she is telling the main character, and then it also switches back and forth between that and then also our current timeline in which the author is telling our main character this story. There are some other things that are going on within Margaret's life, and then also points in which the main character Margaret is trying to take some of the threads from this story she is being told and like fact check them as much as she can, and also kind of tie them back to people, places, things that are happening in her current timeline. So there were two reasons that I wanted to read this book specifically. One is just that it is a book about books. Whenever you try to Google like books about books, this one comes up, and I've heard really great things about it. I also wanted to read it because a friend of mine recommended it to me, so that just kind of like furthered my desire to read this like tour about it. But this ended up really not working for me. There are a lot of reasons why. One of them is just like the stylistic choices of the author. I could not stand the writing style in this book, and that was very much a stylistic choice on the author's part. So not that I necessarily think it's poorly written, but it was really not a choice that I appreciated, because I think the author is kind of going for a more old-fashioned style that is trying to be more like a classic, and this book talks a lot about classics and specifically references Jane Eyre a lot, which I think it was trying to like maybe pattern the writing style kind of after that, and I did not like it. I felt like the sentences were really awkward to read because they were very long and they had so many commas and clauses in them that it made for a really like awkward cadence to the reading, and I could never really get into the flow of reading. And so for people who like to read classics, that might not be a problem for you. You might enjoy the writing style more if that is a style of writing that you read frequently or just appreciate. It was not one that worked for me. I also felt like the author described a lot of stuff, but didn't necessarily describe it in a way that was meaningful or evocative. So like I do like description in books, but I do think that there's a difference between describing a lot of things and describing things well, or describing things in a way that is meaningful to either the story, the character, the atmosphere, whatever. And I very much felt like she was just describing things a lot and not necessarily in a way that was purposeful, to me at least. So I almost DNF'd this, but I decided to switch to an audiobook to see if I would like it better because the writing style was getting on my nerves so much. And the audiobook was definitely better for me because the writing style didn't bother me as an audiobook. But I ended up still really not connecting with the story. I wasn't really interested in any of the characters in this or connected to any of them, so I had a really hard time caring about anything that was happening in this. I didn't really care about the mystery of this woman's life. And I think it also just had a lot of tropes that I personally don't like. It did have incest in it. Like, it doesn't happen on page, and it's kind of implied but pretty obvious that's what happened. And we all know that I hate a book with incest, no matter how vaguely implied. And it had some other things that I guess I don't necessarily want to say because they would be spoilers, but there are certain things about how the story wrapped up and certain like plot points that happened that are tropes or elements that I specifically personally really dislike and may not bother other people at all, but for me, no, I don't like it. I also just wasn't into like the atmosphere of this story, which like atmosphere is a big thing for me, and I think that that's because it is a gothic story, which like I don't really know if I haven't read a lot of like gothic inspired stuff. And so I actually ended up Googling like what makes something a gothic novel, just because I wanted to know like what are the elements of this that are gothic. And a lot of the stuff that I found, I was like, oh yeah, this is not stuff that I want to read about. This is not a vibe that I'm into. This is not like what I want to read. And so I think that just in a lot of ways, this was not one that was for me. So this is another case where I'm just like, I don't necessarily think it's a bad book, but it was apparently so very not my taste. And I didn't really realize that until I was already like pretty far into the book and really starting to see the like themes and elements of it that made it a gothic novel. So yeah, I did not like this. And I think that I just, from my reading experience, I did not get out of this what I think the intended like experience or reaction was meant to be. Because I think that you're sort of supposed to feel this melancholic empathy for these characters and what they have gone through. And at the end of the book, that is not how I felt. I just felt icky and I didn't like it. And then I went and told a bunch of people about it because I was just like, I need to tell someone about this because now I just have this like icky feeling that I don't like. Anyways, not a fan. I think I gave it 3 stars on Goodreads. It probably should have been more like a 2.5, something like that. I don't know. Then very opposite from that, I read The Tea Dragon Tapestry by Katie O'Neill, which is a middle grade fantasy graphic novel. This is the 3rd one in the Tea Dragon Society series. And this whole series is just so like wholesome and adorable and sweet and heartwarming and just like all of the cute things. So I really like, this was the perfect thing to read after the just like icky feeling that I got from the 13th tale. But yeah, this just came out and it was, you know, just as adorable as the rest of the series. I still think that the Tea Dragon Festival is still my favorite in the trilogy, but I had a lot of fun reading this one. In this one, we're actually catching up with some of the characters that we met in the first 2 books, and we kind of get to see them, you know, a little bit later, and some crossover between those characters, which was really fun. Which actually, to explain a little bit, I guess, about what this is about, this is set in a magical world in which there are tea dragons, which are these little tiny dragons who grow tea leaves on their horns, and the different types of tea have different like personalities. So chamomile tea dragons are very sleepy, and it is just a very adorable book and I loved it. Next, I read Over the Woodward Wall by A. Deborah Baker, which is Seanan McGuire. So this is a book that is meant to exist in the world of Middle Game by Seanan McGuire. So in Middle Game, they are constantly talking about the improbable road that leads to the impossible city, and that is from a children's story in that world, which is kind of that world's version of like the Wizard of Oz. So it is like a portal fantasy, and it is written by someone in that world named A. Deborah Baker, who is an alchemist. And so Seanan McGuire has now written this book, which is the beginning of that story. So this is, I think, very clearly the beginning of a series. So we're following 2 kids named Zib and Avery, and they are very much opposites. Avery is very like regimented and very like proper, and Zib is very like wild and free, and they have very different approaches to life, but they both end up kind of accidentally crossing over this wall and end up in the Up and Under, which is this magical world. And they end up on the improbable road as they are trying to find their way back home, and they encounter lots of other people and creatures along the way, and they develop friendships. And so this is, and I think this is more of like a middle grade age. Like Middle Game is definitely an adult book, but this is a children's book that exists in that world. So this could be read just as like a standalone middle grade story. And this one, I kind of went into it knowing I might not like it that much because I'm not a big fan of like portal fantasies. I don't like The Wizard of Oz, really. And so that comparison did not entice me. I really was only reading this because I wanted more information or context for what was being referenced in Middle Game. So reading this, I was very lukewarm about it. Like, I didn't hate it, but I also just didn't really care about anything that was happening in this because it's just really not my kind of book and not something that really entices me. But like, as I said, I knew that going in, so it wasn't a disappointment. It just sort of was what it was. So I also didn't give this a rating. But if she does write more books in this series, which I am assuming there's going to be more books because of the way this ended, it didn't feel like it really concluded, then I will probably read them again, more so for context than for enjoyment. Then next up, I read The Devouring Gray by Christine Lynn Herman. This is the first book in a duology that I don't know the name of, but it is a YA contemporary fantasy that is set in this town called Four Paths. And Four Paths was founded by 4 founding families, and those families each have magical powers because there was this like magical beast that the founding families trapped in what they call the Gray, which is kind of this parallel world to the town. And so the beast is trapped in the Gray, and from trapping the beast, these families kind of gained magical powers, and each family sort of has like a theme to their magic. And so the families in this town have slowly been weakening in their magic over the generations. And at the start of this, we're following multiple perspectives because we're following the perspective of one kid from each of the founding families. But at the start of the story, one of those founding families kind of comes back into town, and one of the main characters is Violet, who is one of those family members that came back into town. And that kind of sets off some things going on in the town, and we find out more about the history of the town and these families and secrets that have been kept and conspiracies that are going on behind the scenes. And there are a lot of things that are not as they appear. So I buddy read this with my friend Musetta, which was really fun. We got to talk about some of the things that we really liked about this and the things that did not make sense in this. Because in a lot of ways, this book was pretty fun. Like, there are a lot of things, a lot of tropes, especially character tropes, that I really enjoyed, and I liked a lot of the premise of this. I think that the family magic was interesting, and I liked that the families each had like a theme to their magic, but there definitely were a lot of plot holes in this, especially surrounding the way the magic worked. There's so much of this story that is just completely underexplained. I did find that the writing, drew me in pretty quickly, which was nice. So I did get like into the book really easily, but then it kind of like plateaued for me. I also feel like while the writing was easy to read, it definitely didn't have much atmosphere to it, which I felt like this was the kind of book that is meant to be atmospheric, and I just did not feel the atmosphere through any of this. So there definitely were things that were fun about this. It drew me in quickly. I enjoyed a lot of the tropes that it used, but there was so much that was unexplained and was so like convenient, and the characters, while I enjoyed their general like archetype or trope, felt very hollow and underdeveloped. The relationships between them also were relationship tropes that I enjoy, but again were very underdeveloped and very much like told that these characters, are very close friends without really showing it in a way that felt authentic. So I gave this one 3 stars. It was fine. I don't think I'm going to be continuing the series though. Next, I read House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. This was on my fall TBR. This is the one that you guys voted for me to read. This is a YA fantasy that is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses. In this, 3 or 4 of the daughters of a duke have died, and the family believes that they may be cursed, or some of the people believe they might be cursed. Some of them don't really believe it. And our main character, I think her name is Annalay, I'm not totally sure how to pronounce it. she is the like main perspective that we are following, and she thinks that some of her sisters have been murdered, and so she's trying to figure out what happened to them and figure out like who could have killed them, when she starts seeing ghosts, and she doesn't really, and she's kind of unable to trust what is real and what is not. But around this time, she and her sisters also find a magical portal to these beautiful balls that they can go to. And so that's the 12 Dancing Princesses part, where they go to these balls every night and they wear out their shoes. And so that is kind of happening at the same time that our main character is trying to track down what happened to her sisters, and also kind of struggling with what is reality or not. And this is all set on an island that worships a sea god, and they are very like identified with being like of the ocean and what they call the salt. So this book had kind of this one had like a strong start and then a not so great end for me. Overall, I did have a fun time reading this, but like it didn't end in a way that like was satisfying to me. So in the first half, it definitely drew me in right away. I liked the atmosphere. I just was very invested very quickly. I liked the sister dynamics that it involved. And I think that it did a really good job of making me care very quickly. I felt like the writing really propels you forward, and it was like very easy to read and just kept moving forward because of the writing style. And yeah, I liked the creepy vibes that it had. I kind of wish that the creepiness of it had been more consistent throughout it, because there were definite lulls. Personally, I did not find it scary at all. But through a lot of the book, especially in the second half, my face while reading was very like this, which like, I don't know what that tells you in terms of like a review, but that was the face I was making. There's a romance in it that I was not super invested in. Like, it felt like it happened pretty quickly. Like they went pretty quickly from like, oh, I just met you, to like, you are my world, which I don't know. The romance wasn't necessarily the central part of the plot. I think if the romance had been more central, that would have bothered me more, but since it was more of a side plot, it didn't bother me as much. It just meant that I was less invested in it. But really the thing that kind of downgraded this book for me was the ending. The mystery ended in a way that I really dislike for mysteries, because it kind of felt like they didn't really solve a mystery so much as just find somebody to explain everything for them. And I just find that very unsatisfying in mysteries when it doesn't feel as earned, because it doesn't feel like they really solved anything. It just feels like they kind of futzed around until they found a person who could just do like a whole chunk of exposition explaining everything that happened. So that's just not a satisfying mystery ending to me. It also at the end had a lot of exposition of like at least 2 or 3 times where people would just be like, let me explain the whole plot to you, and had one of those like villain monologues where it's like breaking up the action. There was this one scene that was like kind of gruesome and was very like, there's a lot of action going on, and then they're just like, let's just take a break to have a villain monologue. The first half and the second half were just very different experiences for me, and so I'm not quite sure how I feel about this. Overall, I did have a fun time reading it, and I would definitely read something else from this author. I think she has another book coming out next year, so I'll probably pick that up at some point, but I gave this one 3 stars. And then finally, the last book that I read in October was His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik. This is the first book in her Temeraire series, which is a historical fantasy that is about the Napoleonic Wars, but with dragons. So if the aerial force were dragon riders. So in this, we are following a naval captain named Captain Lawrence, who apprehends a ship that happens to have a dragon egg on it. And soon after capturing this ship, the dragon egg hatches and the dragon attaches itself to Captain Lawrence. And so he is now destined to be part of the aerial force because he is now bonded to this dragon. So he has to go off, leave his life as a naval captain behind, and learn how to be a dragon rider. And this one, like, the book is very cute. The relationship between the main character and the dragon is so pure and so sweet. The dragons in this do talk. Temeraire, who is the main dragon in this story, is very intelligent and is also very affectionate and very attached to Captain Lawrence, and so their bond is just very sweet and was really the highlight of this book. I really loved the first half of this. This is another one that, like, the first half and the second half were like kind of different for me, because the first half very much focuses on establishing the dynamic between Captain Lawrence and Temeraire and their relationship, just so pure, and I love it so much. And then the second half, they kind of got more into, they started going into like battles and things like that, which I really did not care about. And there were still definite like character moments, relationship moments, and stuff like that throughout the second part, even like while they were in battles or between battles and things like that. So it's not like it was very cut and dry, like, oh, the first half was about the relationship and the second half wasn't. But I found that I really, like, I'm not interested in the Napoleonic Wars. That is not a time period for historical fiction that I'm especially interested in, which is why I've kind of put off reading this series, even though I have liked other books by this author. And I think that that just continued to be true for me, that, you know, I was not really interested in the parts of the book where they would start talking about the war, where they would talk about, you know, whose troops are where. And I ended up really just zoning out during those parts because I really didn't care. I really wanted just the dragon human dynamic. That was all I cared about. So I am planning to read more from this series because I do like these characters a lot and I had a fun time reading about them, but I'm a little bit concerned because I feel like as it goes, it's going to get more into the plotty part of it, which will be more involved in like the war and the battles, and that's obviously not the part that I care about. So I'm not sure. I probably will be continuing it, but I'm not sure how high up on my priority list it is going to be. If you've read this series though, and read past the first book, and you know like how much it focuses on the war and the battles, let me know, because I am very curious about it, because I do want to read more, as I said, but I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about it if it focuses so much on the battles and the war part. But I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. Then this month I had one DNF, which was And the Trees Crept In by Dawn Kurtagich, and then I have 2 books that I am currently reading. So right now the physical book that I am reading is Green Rider by Kristen Britton. I am not very far into it yet. I'm only about 50 pages into this book, but I am liking it so far. This is an adult fantasy. And then I am listening to the audiobook of You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. And I like just started it, so I don't have a lot of opinions about it yet, but I've heard fabulous things about it. So that is all for my October wrap up. If you have read any of these books, talk to me about it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!